Welcome again to our research seminar of the Center for the Study of World Christianity, University of Edinburgh. I'm Alex Chow, and I'm a senior lecturer here in theology and world Christianity. It's my pleasure today to host this panel discussion in which we will be exploring the question of researching Chinese Christianity in the 2020s. And this is a question that for myself, I've been quite interested in, largely because I've been researching the subject of Chinese Christianity for over a decade now. And over that decade, there's been a lot of changes. I think this is an opportune time to pause and to consider the situation of not only China, but Chinese Christianity globally. And to consider what that means for the study of Chinese Christianity. And today, I'm glad to be able to have pulled in a number of colleagues from different parts of the world to join in this conversation. And there are a number of other colleagues on this call, scholars of Chinese Christianity on this call as well. So welcome to this conversation. The main panelists for today's conversation, there are three of them. The first one I'll introduce is the colleague to my left here, Dr. Mark McLeister, who's a lecturer in Chinese studies here at the University of Edinburgh in the School of Languages, Literature, and Culture. Or Literature, Languages, and Culture, one or the other. I always mix it up. But Dr. Mark McLeister is, his earlier education was in social anthropology, and later on did work in international relations and Chinese business, and then later on completed a PhD in Chinese studies at Sheffield. Dr. McLeister's specialty is, research specialty is on the three self-patriotic movement within mainland China. And methodologically, he comes from an ethnographic disciplinary approach. We have on the Zoom call Professor Chloë Starr joining us from New Haven, or perhaps New Haven, from Yale Divinity School. Chloë is, Professor Starr is a professor of Asian Christianity and theology, and her earlier scholarship was dealing with Chinese literature. In particular, she has a book published on red light novels of the late Qing dynasty in China. And but how I first encountered the work of Professor Starr was in her edited volume, Reading Christian Scriptures in China, which was a great book that talks about in particular the Bible, reading the Bible, but also other types of Christian writings. And most recently in 2016, she published the book Chinese Theology, which as I tell students here, she wrote it before I could write it. She wrote the book that I wanted to write. So good job for you, Professor Starr. Thank you very much for joining us. We also have on the call Dr. Kevin Xiyi from Gordon-Conwell Theological Seminary. Dr. Yao is an associate professor of world Christianity and Asian studies, and he is perhaps very well known for his work of fundamentalism, the fundamentalist movement among Protestant missions in China, which is a work that I refer to quite often in terms of understanding the history and the development of Christianity in China. Dr. Yao's and I have, I got to know Dr. Yao through a project on Wang Weifan, who is a TSPM evangelical within the TSPM, and he edited a volume on Wang Weifan theology and life, and I was involved in that project, and that's how we first met. Dr. Yao is, whereas Dr. McLeister comes from an ethnographic perspective, Professor Starr from a theological perspective, Dr. Yao is of course a historian and a very good historian at that. And so, as you can tell from the panel, I've contacted different scholars coming from different disciplinary positions, all of whom have interests in Chinese Christianity and have written and researched on the subject for a number of years. I very much want to thank all of our panelists for joining us. I very much appreciate not only their scholarship, but them as people and as colleagues and friends that I've gotten to know over the years. But I think also it's worth just an observation that each of the scholars that are on the panel do not have Chinese Christianity on their titles. I think it's quite interesting by itself that these scholars who work on the field of Chinese Christianity don't have that in the titles of their job titles. And in fact, for many of us, I should include myself in this, many of us, we all often find ourselves in multiple fields or within Chinese studies or Asian studies or world Christianity. And it kind of fits into something else because, of course, Chinese Christianity is a field of study, but not a discipline, right? It does not have its own specific methodological approaches, but it borrows and it converses with different methodological approaches of the various disciplines around. And so I'm very pleased to have these scholars with us, but I think it's of course an interesting observation, not only for Chinese Christianity, but also for the field of world Christianity, which this center is known for, that world Christianity as a field is one that individuals, scholars, students, those who are interested, come to the subject from various disciplinary approaches, different methodological considerations. There's of course overlap, but in these approaches, but I think that's worth noting at the outset. So without further ado, the format for this afternoon, at least the afternoon in Edinburgh, it may be evening for some of you or mornings for others, but the format for our time is for the first 45 or so minutes, I have a set of questions that I've prepared our panelists with that I'd like to raise to them and have them respond to. But then after that, we'll have a time for wider conversation. So please do think about questions and feel free to raise them after the general discussion. I'm going to start a question, and I'm going to begin with asking Professor Starr if to answer this question, and for you to answer. Yes, you've unmuted. Great. I'm going to start this question, and this is a question I'm asking all the panelists to answer. And very simply, Professor Starr, if you could just say briefly, how did you get into the study of Chinese Christianity? And what drew you towards the specific disciplinary approach that you find yourself in?
Well, I see you've offered us 1 to 2 minutes to talk about this. So the very brief, shortened version of the answer is that I've actually just changed while listening to you. To focus on the discipline part, as you said, many of us come from other disciplines. I have several degrees in Chinese literature, and I actually came to the academic study, not to Chinese Christianity itself. I came to Chinese Christianity sitting on little 6-inch iron stools in churches and being offered cigarettes instead of a handshake before the service started. But I came to the academic study of Chinese Christianity via late Qing fiction and textual studies. And then I worked on prayer books to begin with and brought some of my thinking about late Qing texts and textual theories and textual change into study of 19th and 20th century Christian prayer books, and then moved on from there into working on Chinese Christian fiction and theology.
Thank you very much. I think we'll interrogate this a little bit more in a moment. Professor Yao, can I ask you to jump in, please?
Sure. Yes. I'm always consider myself just historian, Protestant Christianity in China. So I started my career, academic career, as a historian, as a history major student in world history, and later, and I focused on the Reformation study. And when I start to do my PhD with Dr. Dana Robert in the, I would say in the mid 1990s, and I settled with history of Christianity in China. And methodologically, I would say I'm influenced by, of course, Dr. Roberts' approach, which is more theological and missiological, and also historical. I would say the combination. And also, I think I'm greatly influenced by someone like George Marsden and Mark Knorr, and and I just named, I just make a, just name few of them, so my approach to the history of Christianity in China. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Already we have from our first two panelists, we already see how people have come to the subject in very different ways, different journeys, both intellectual journeys and perhaps personal journeys towards the subject, the academic subject, but also the lived reality of Chinese Christianity. That's perhaps a good segue to our third panelist, Dr. McLeister, please.
Okay, well, I suppose my way into Chinese Christianity was a bit of a reverse here. So I first trained in social anthropology and did a 4-year degree at St. Andrews where we covered nothing on China at all. And then went to China because I had an interest in it. Went there initially just for a year or two and ended up staying there a bit longer. And while I was there, and I guess because of my disciplinary training in anthropology, attending churches and talking to people, I began to develop a whole series of questions, which I later pursued in my PhD. So I suppose for me, my interest didn't begin with Chinese Christianity. My interest began more with, I suppose, methods and how we understand Chinese society. But for me, the main questions about Chinese society that sort of came to the surface were about Christianity and how Christians in China live out their lives, and in particular, how the church interacts with officialdom and the state.
Thank you very much, Dr. McLeister. I find it quite interesting that you say that when you study social anthropology, there was nothing about China, and I think for many of us, whether our field of interest is Chinese Christianity or forms of African Christianity or what have you, oftentimes the disciplines or our trajectories of study do not have that much of an interest in China and Africa and so forth, unless it's Chinese studies or African studies or whatever, right? I know for my own self, I'm not a panelist here, but I'll take convener's license and just interject just briefly my own journey. When I went down theological studies, nothing that I studied was on China, and I wanted to study China. But nothing I studied, and I had to figure out what there is in Chinese Christianity. There were barely, Daniel Bays's, New History of Chinese Christianity in China. I forget how it's titled, but Daniel Bays's book wasn't published yet. And I was basing things on, La Tourette's, mission history, which is like, early 1900s, right? So it's definitely changed the field, and I don't consider myself that senior, but it has definitely changed in over the course of my career. I mean, I think perhaps we could go to our next question, which is very much related to this. And I'm going to ask Dr. Yao to begin us with a response here. But it's really the question that if each of you could perhaps very briefly trace the development of the field of Chinese Christianity from your own disciplinary approach, as in how the discipline and the field have developed over the years. And if it has a very short life, that's fine as well. But if there's more, that even the better. Dr. Yao.
All right. So as a historian, I can only make a comment on the history, particularly history of Protestant Christianity in China. In my view, we can identify basically 3 phases of the development of the field. I think the first one is from 1920s to 1950s. If you name, a couple of outstanding representatives, scholars, you can name, and Kenneth Lottery and history of Christian missions in China. That's probably the masterpiece for English language study. Well, in Chinese language study, you can name Wang Zhixin, Zhixin Wang. That's probably very influential in the Chinese world. And that's probably the first phase. And second phase, I would say, is from 1950s, I would say, to 1980s. I think on the one hand, you have a number of church-based Chinese scholars working in this field. But I would say the major breakthrough is really took place in the 1960s and 1970s. You remember John King Fairbank and his student and his colleagues entered the field and basically brought in the perspective of modern Chinese history. And so they produced some of the most influential work and still influential today. And that's probably changed the field for good. I would say that's probably the second phase. Third phase is from 1980s to now. And you would say, based on what happened in the 1960s and 70s, what you say is a further diversification of the field. As Dr. Chow mentioned at the beginning, you really have the proliferation of a multiple approach to the history of Christianity in China. And from historical perspective, theological perspective, and from sociological perspective, anthropology, you name it, literature study, social cultural study, and all kinds of course, very influential is the history of modern China. And you have all kinds of approach, all kinds of perspective. So it's just so much so that it's very hard to identify the identity of this field. And it's very hard to identify a single discipline, as Dr. Chow mentioned. So this is very interesting, because when you compare this field with, say, something like a history of Christianity in the US, in America, and say the history of Buddhism in China, and you can say, and the other discipline, the history of British Buddhism, history of American Christianity, they are the discipline. They have a coherent identity. But you ask, what is identity? What is coherence of field of study of Chinese Christianity? What comes to our mind is a diversification, is a diversity, is a richness. So I would say there is some good thing about it, and there's some question about it, and what the future holds. for this field, is possible for this field to further develop into something like discipline. And it's something we can talk about, and we can explore in the future. So that's all I want to say.
Thank you very much, Dr. Yao. Professor Starr, could I ask you to join?
Sure. So if I just concentrate on literature, on Chinese literature, Chinese Christian literature, there's been a debate on, what is Chinese Christian literature very recently in the last sort of 5 or 10 years. Does it include all of the, the late Qing tracts that the Protestant missionaries created? Does it include the history of Bible translation, or is Chinese Christian literature really just that fiction that began in the kind of some of it in the late Qing essay competitions in the newspapers, but mainly in the 1920s with the May 4th Revolution and the Literary Revolution? So, the parameters of the field are, again, not very clear. Early on, if you're thinking about the study of the Bible in China, it was non-Christians or sympathetic people like Zhou Zuoren who actually did most of the work as literary critics and scholars. Somebody like Zhu Weizhe later wrote on, what is the Bible as literature? And then if you think about what the field has become now, the study of Chinese Christian fiction, in the 1990s, we skip ahead, and people like Ma Jia or Yang Jianlong have done a lot of work creating a kind of canon of who are the Chinese Christian authors and coming up with sort of 15 names. As you say, a lot of this history has been occluded in the early period and systematically excised from literary histories. If you look up, Bing Xin, Lao She, Ding Ling, you will not see their Christian biographies in most of the standard textbooks. So there's a certain amount of retrieval and recovery going on at the moment. And then currently, we don't have many English-speaking people working on Chinese Christian fiction. Lewis Robinson in '86, his volume is still the standard and the only monograph in the field at the moment. But there's been an explosion of Chinese Christian fiction and writing from the 1990s and 2000s with a lot of new writers who began life as authors rather than as Christians, so tend to write slightly better than those people who want to write from a Christian standpoint but don't have the literary skills. And there's been new developments. So there's been a lot of writing about spiritual literature and this whole new category, subcategory within Chinese Christian fiction of spiritual literature recently. So the field is expanding rapidly, I think, is my bottom line there.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Dr. McLeister.
I suppose in some ways, if we're looking at this from a sort of social anthropological or ethnographical perspective, the story is quite short. But actually, it would be worth pointing out that, you can't ignore the missionary contribution to the development of social anthropology and to ethnography as a method. And although not many sort of high quality empirical studies came out of the missionary era in China, I think we have to, for better or worse, acknowledge the roots of that discipline and that method back there. I think if we're thinking specifically of even slightly more broadly in terms of social science, empirically based studies, then really there's nothing until the 1980s. And I suppose Hunter and Chan's volume in the early 90s was the first sort of decent overview of what things were like in the late 80s, early 90s in the People's Republic of China. On top of that, I suppose some well-informed church observers like Tony Lambert producing, very, very well-informed stuff, perhaps less methodologically rigorous than some social scientists would like. But I think we have to acknowledge those as well. And since the 1990s, yes, there's been a trickle of ethnographic studies. Most notably, sort of latterly, Canan Lai's stuff, and Kang Jie, for example. But there's still a real dearth of what I would term sort of proper ethnographic studies, some article length stuff, not many monographs. And I suppose in some way the social science side of Chinese Christianity is still dominated in terms of publications by political scientists. So I think there's quite a short story to tell about ethnography in Chinese Christianity.
That's an interesting, that last bit I thought was quite interesting in terms of the political science, because oftentimes I find that those who are interested in Chinese Christianity are interested in this question, church-state relations. You know, that becomes like the clincher question, right? In which it's an important question, but it's much more than just that. You know, and that in many ways it biases the questions. It biases the inquiry, because the question is very political in its engagement. But it's the understanding of politics in China is vastly different from the U.S. or the U.K. You know, the political systems are vastly different. And how do you engage that, right? I mean, in terms of biases, my next question, you know, kind of carries on from that. In that the actual study of Chinese Christianity, I think the majority of studies that we have, you know, in monographs and collected volumes today, tend to have a focus on the Republican era, maybe the late Qing Republican era, that time frame, and in particular Protestantism. Okay, and a lot of that. That emphasis on the Republican era and late Qing Republican era, you know, early 1900s, and the debates in particular around fundamentalism and modernism. So that's another one of these major tropes within the study of Chinese Christianity is this debate between fundamentalism and modernism. And of course, Dr. Yao's work on fundamentalism, the fundamentalist movement in China is a definite go-to in terms of that type of discourse. But I guess, you know, the question that I want to ask each of our panelists, and we'll start with Dr. Yao on this, is how does that focus, is that focus a good focus? Perhaps that's a too simple of a question. How does that focus affect our study of Chinese Christianity? You know, many people who talk about contemporary Chinese Christianity still focus on the Protestant, fundamentalist, modernist discourse and apply it to contemporary times China, for instance. You know, is that sufficient? Is the fact that the focus is on Protestantism, is that a problem? You know, or is that a benefit? I'll start with Dr. Yao, please.
Yes, you know, I definitely agree with Dr. Chow about many things about this overall assessment of the field. We have disproportionately focused on the Republican years when we come to the study of history of Christianity in China, especially the Protestant story. I think there are many good reasons for this. You know, for example, just a name, I believe that's really the critical transition, you know, and from the more traditional Christian story to the contemporary Christian story, especially in mainland China. And that's really the formation period of Chinese Christianity. And it's the first half century of 20th century, first 50 years of 20th century. That's a really critical period. And also secondly, I think I just named another reason. I think I forgot to mention the name of Dr. Daniel Bays. And he is still the towering figures in the history, in the study of history Christianity. You know, that's his field. You know, and especially given the influence of John King Fairbank, and don't forget they are the historian modern China. You know, and also that's a period they focus on. And I would say there's a good reason, and we still have a lot of research need to do, but we do miss a lot. The fact that in my judgment, I think this field of history of Christianity in China is a pretty fragmented field, you know, and you have an expert in Nestorian stories in Tang Dynasty. You have few expert in the Nestorian stories in the Yuan Dynasty. Then you have expert in the late Qing dynasty, and of course, Republican era and contemporary. And we don't necessarily talk to each other. We really don't know what's going on and in their respective field, But I think the historians in the Republican years, expert in the history of Republican years, is probably more influential, more dominant. But that's mean, and sometimes we miss a lot. And, and I believe sometimes we think when we look at the 19th century, the Christian story, Christian history in China, we sometimes think, oh, that's only the missionary, Western missionary era. And, the Chinese Christians, native Christians didn't produce anything significant. But it may not be true. May not be true, and we need to dig them up. We need to try harder, and also what about sometimes when we talk about the history of Christianity in Republican years, we turn to focus on 1920s and to 1937s. What happened during the Sino-Japanese War and to the church? What happened to the Christianity after the end of Second World War and to 1949? And there were a lot happened and very significant accomplishments and in those years. And but we have a lot of work to do to find out.
Dr. McLeister, do you want to take it from the other end of history, if you will?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose tracing things back to seeing how things have developed since the Republican era, as Dr. Yao has already said, an emphasis on missionary narratives rather than indigenous converts and leaders. I think that's starting to be broken down a little bit now. But certainly another major influence from the Republican era is seeing this sort of conservative modernist or fundamentalist modernist debate. And seeing how that has gone through the 1950s and what was happening, particularly in the People's Republic of China, seeing how certainly the church, or we could say the church, but certainly things took different trajectories for different denominations and groups. And seeing very much today, perhaps, how that is still read into much of what goes on in the People's Republic of China in terms of the various Christianities that we find. And this is still, I would say, a bit of a hindrance in seeing or in allowing us to see the complexity of what is there. I certainly think on the ground things are always much more complex and nuanced than theological debates that perhaps go back to the 1950s and earlier. And so we can still see that influence, and that influence impacts how things are framed. But I also think outside of research, there's also the influence of these debates in terms of how the Chinese state views Christianity or Christianities. And I think that's also another layer of complexity. As researchers, do we play into the hands of narratives that are not as strong, or are we critical enough of those narratives in our own research? And I think these are things that have to be considered. And going back to a point that Alex made, and I sort of touched on earlier about church-state interactions, I think this is still a very dominant sort of field of inquiry within Chinese Christianity, certainly on the empirical side of things. And I wonder if really we need to get beyond that and see what else Chinese Christianities in China have to offer in terms of what we can learn.
Thank you very much. I think this raises, both of these panelists have raised a lot of very interesting questions in terms of trying to diversify our understanding of things and go beyond the biases that we have or the field itself has. Professor Starr, who, of course, has written a book on Chinese theology, and that book is one that breaks a lot of these molds in many ways, and transcends the history of Chinese Christianity, as well as looking at Protestants and Catholics, and methodologically, she's drawn on her literary background as well in terms of her engagement with Chinese theology. Professor Starr, would you like to respond to this question?
Yeah, so as you know, my favorite period is the Republican era. But that said, I do fundamentally disagree with the premise of your question here, Dr. Chow. I think it's a North American scholarship bias. I think if you look at what's going on in European and Chinese scholarship, Professor Yao mentioned the work on the Jingjiao that's going on, Tsinghua, other universities, huge studies of Syriac Christianity in China. Fudan and Shanghai and the Jesuit studies and Leuven University in Europe. If you look at the volume of scholarship on Catholic Christianity coming out of China and the Europe, I think it dwarfs the Protestant scholarship. I think we just don't read it. We don't know about it enough, and we don't read the languages in which we need to. So I'm on the EU-China listserv, and practically every day I get voluminous details of new Chinese scholarly articles on aspects of pre-modern Chinese Christianity. Xiao Qinghe in Shanghai, he also runs a Chinese equivalent of that EU-China listserv, and all the same articles get shunted between those things. There's a vast scholarship in Chinese, and to a degree in English, but not it coming out of North America largely, on all sorts of, I just looked at a couple of this last week's topics on things I've had essay titles on the changing Renaissance worldview in Europe, and on the Western modernity culture of time based on biblical chronology, shifting Chinese understandings of time in the 17th and 18th century, about the rights controversy not being a religious thing as we think of it, but actually about a debate on ancient history, about tides and all this scientific work. Despite very different cosmologies, Europe and China managed to produce tide tables that were effectively the same at this point. And so people are wondering, how did you do that? Because we have very different understandings of what was forming tides at that time. So, there's this vast scientific, musical, Christian, theological, historical scholarship going on in pre-modern Chinese Christianity that is not making it to our syllabi in the way it should. And we ought to be considering that and trying to integrate them more. So I value the opportunity to have a little rant here. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you very much. And I always appreciate a different perspective on what I raise up. Perhaps we'll turn to sort of one of the major questions that, one of the big questions that has been preoccupying me in terms of the study of Chinese Christianity, and that is what do we do about the study of Chinese Christianity today? And in particular, the reason I raise that question is since the 2010s, in particular, the context of Chinese Christians, if you will, has been shifting, and obviously contexts change all the time, right? But since we're very, I'm not a historian by nature, and so I'm very conscious of the things around me. Oftentimes it is the things around us in our contemporary period that affect the way that we look at and that we study our particular field. So within mainland China, there's been shifts in the political and the social scene, but also we see shifts within Hong Kong, within Taiwan, in particular, in terms of the political dimensions and the social dimensions there. And we also see within the Chinese Christian diaspora, if you will. I know the term diaspora is often a contentious term, but if we just use that for the moment, Chinese Christians in the Americas and in the UK and Europe, in Australia, have been gaining a stronger public voice, if you will, and in second and third generations have been shifting the conversation. But my point is that the context is really changing, and for me, I'm just very present with these things. And perhaps Dr. McLeister could begin us. How does that change the way you study Chinese Christianity, and how do you see that shifting the field moving forward?
Yeah, I think this is a really good question, and I think I have lots of different ideas, but I'll not talk about them all. I think, firstly, fundamentally, for empirical, certainly for me, ethnographic work in China, I think access may become an issue. It may not. I think people are still continuing to do work on the ground. People are still producing research, and I don't know how long that will be able to continue for some people. But for the moment, that certainly seems doable for the foreseeable future. I think one danger is to read the concerns that we have into the concerns of people on the ground. I would be very wary of assuming that at the forefront of anyone in the communities that I research is something political, or something related to what is happening politically in China. And perhaps we shouldn't preempt what we're doing and the questions that we're asking with our concerns, but actually, in terms of dealing with people on the ground at the grassroots, is to ask and continue to seek to ask what their concerns are and what really they're doing, rather than assume that because for us we have a question, therefore that question will be shared by everyone on the ground. So that's certainly something that I would remind myself, but would also encourage the rest of us who do more empirically based stuff to bear in mind. We shouldn't be asking the wrong questions, but we should be sort of thinking about, framing whatever we do in ways that allow people to sort of voice what's important to them. I wonder if, for some people, this will mean refocusing and thinking about communities of Chinese Christians or Chinese churches outside of China or Greater China. And in fact, over the next decade, we may see, an increase in the rate at which studies are done in these other contexts. That may be something that will happen, but I'm not sure. And I think lastly, there could be very practical impacts to the field other than access, and that is, we're seeing increasingly polarized views about what China is and what that means. And will that affect things like access to funding? There may be very political motivations for researchers and how they're impacted by that. So there's some of my reflections. I do have more to say, but I think we'll hand on to other people.
Thank you very much. Dr. Yao, would you like to come in here?
Yeah, and and I can only speak because my regular contacts are those people in the study of history of Protestant Christianity. I just feel overall it's getting more difficult to do that kind of study, especially in the Chinese language. This has to do with the political as well as the financial factors. In terms of access to the primary sources, especially in the Chinese context, and opportunity to publish, and for academic promotion. And, it's those days I tried, I think it's very hard to have any manuscript published. Forget about mainland China, but, even in Taiwan and Hong Kong. That has a lot to do with the financial difficulties, but social, political as well, and so now talking about the opportunity to how, to sponsor academic conference And more and more, those conferences can only take place overseas. And so it's you can see the difference now from a few years ago, and so it's very real. And I think my concern it's going to turn away lots of those young generation of scholars away from the field, and especially the Chinese young scholars from the field. And so but it's a lot more can be done probably overseas, even more than before.
Increasingly, the real challenge for scholars coming from China who are studying Chinese Christianity, who want to go to China to study China with an interest in Chinese Christianity, in terms of the changes in different realms. Professor Starr, would you like to take this question?
I can only agree with what my two colleagues have said so far. And I appreciated Mark's point about the difference between the questions we might be asking and those that our Chinese colleagues and friends are asking. One thing to say, there have always been cycles of repression and relaxation in Chinese history since at least the Qin dynasty, if not before then. So, there are short-term, medium-term and long-term strategies to take here, and unknowns in all of those at the moment. I work with texts, so, less of a problem for me personally, but one of the big questions in Chinese theology is really Hong Kong. And that's where my worry is at the moment, what the NSL, the new security law, will mean, what the future of CUHK, the Center of Chinese Theological Study, Chinese University in Hong Kong, where so many colleagues are concentrated, and because they are worried, we worry for them and for that future at the moment, and what that means and what basic law in Hong Kong will mean in the future. And, the significant degree of fear and worry among Hong Kong colleagues is permeating the field and all of us at the moment. On the other note, you mentioned maybe the study will shift to diasporic Chinese communities, second generation, third generation. I teach an Asian American theologies course. I was in class yesterday, and the questions in Asian American theology and the frame are very different from Chinese theology and Asian theology. And that's one of the first things that the students perceive when they start studying it, that it's a third thing. It's a totally different subject. It's not a combination of, or continuation of some form of Chinese theology in the States. That's not how it works as a field, I don't think, really. Others may disagree. So I think the questions asked by that, they will be very different questions. And if the trajectory is more concentration on, outside of China, I think you will end up with two completely separate tracks and trajectories of scholarship at that point. So I don't think one, I think they're parallel. You can't substitute for what's going on in China and Chinese church studies for what's going on outside in that way.
Thank you for that, Professor Starr. I mean, I think that's something I feel very personally about, because I consider myself as a Chinese American, even though I live in Scotland, and my kids think otherwise, but for me at least, I'm a Chinese American. Professionally, I've studied largely mainland Chinese theology, and oftentimes I encounter people and say, "Oh, of course you study that. You're Chinese American." Of course, that doesn't connect at all. I'm not sure why that connects. But at the same time, there is this question of, are there things from within China that permeate outward and vice versa? And the question of the transnational dimension, the scholars out there that are trying to promote more of a global understanding of Asian Christianity and Chinese Christianity, and indeed even the program unit that I run in American Academy of Religion is on Chinese Christianities with a plural, and tries to problematize it but not answer the question. Tries to raise that question. Are there overlaps? Are there things that flow in different directions? And perhaps that's a good segue to our last question in a sense. which is really twofold rationale behind this question. And one of them is coming from the fact that this is a seminar of the Center for the Study of World Christianity. And so Chinese Christianity is being discussed in concert with world Christianity. But of course, the other matter is that somebody like Daniel Bayes, who edited the volume Christianity in China from 18th century to the present, and was for me was a major resource for Chinese Christianity in the earlier days, especially. Daniel Bayes notes in his work the commonalities that Chinese Christianity and world Christianity have, and perhaps some of the influences of those two fields. To our panelists, and perhaps beginning with Professor Starr, what do we see in terms of the benefits and that relationship between Chinese Christianity and world Christianity, and how what can they learn from one another as well?
So I'm the worst person to answer this. I should not have gone first. Although I've been in many workshops on world Christianity and sat on panels to appoint colleagues in the field, and my dear colleague Lamin Sane, and read his works, I still don't really understand what constitutes world Christianity as a field, because it's primarily the end of mission history 2.1. It doesn't have and hasn't had a theological focus in the same way, and we don't have a scope for comparative theologies within that, other than models of contextual theology, which only go so far. So I focus on Chinese theology and literature and Chinese Christianity, and I leave the world Christianity elements to those who understand them better.
Thank you very much, Professor Starr. Perhaps we'll go to Dr. Yao, who has world Christianity in his title.
And that's what I have been teaching. Even though I cannot claim I'm expert on global Christianity, I'm more a specialist on Chinese Christianity, especially Protestant Christianity. But still, I feel I benefit a lot by teaching world Christianities at Gordon-Conwell and somewhere else too. I just feel it's always very, very helpful, very, very illuminating to compare the Chinese Christianity with a Christian experience in other contexts. It helped me to say what I was not able to say before. It's very, very helpful. And also, actually one of our participants is from Singapore, a young scholar, Joshua Sim, and I saw his name listed here. And his recent work just show us actually there is a global dimension of even the fundamentalist movement within the Chinese church in the Republican years, and you're talking about Zhang Song, and took the Christian message to Southeast Asia and planted church there. And that's how the church started in Southeast Asia. After 1949, around 1949, and waves of Chinese Christian immigrated and to other parts of the world, and Taiwan and Hong Kong. That's how the Chinese Christianity was globalized. Evangelical Christianity was globalized. So when we study this, we shouldn't really limit our horizon and just to mainland China context. And there is a global dimension and waiting for us to discover, and I think the terminology he used is a transnational Chinese Christianity. I think that's really the good way to go. When we when we study the Chinese Christianity in the future, that's really the one area we can make a breakthrough, and we should really try highlight the global dimension. You don't really talking about, I think you can make a case for the global international dimension of even Nestorian experience in China and the Catholic experience in China. There is always exchange between the East and West. That's always there, so we need to develop a sort of a grand narrative for all this.
Thank you very much, Dr. McLeister.
Well, again, I think this is a good sort of double-sided question. I think my own thoughts, from what I have gleaned from world Christianity and the people who have been sort of foundational to its development, there's a real appreciation for history and for historical context. And I think, seeing people like Daniel Bayes and Gary Tiedemann, who are sort of founding members of Chinese Christianity's passing, I think one thing that perhaps shouldn't be learned but should be maintained is within Chinese Christianity's remembering context and remembering history and remembering why things are the way they are now because of what went before. But then also appreciating that Chinese Christianities can never be a field that's separated from everything else. Seeing that whatever happens in China is both permeated by what is, as we've already said, permeated by what's happening outside, but then also realizing that what is happening inside permeates that which goes on outside. So that's one sort of reflection, is more to do with good historical context and keeping that in mind, regardless of whether you're a theologian or an ethnographer or a political scientist or something else. And I suppose the second main reflection here is to, in terms of Chinese Christianity's impacting world Christianity. And I don't think we've exhausted the intellectual possibilities of what Christianity looks like. And so I think studying Christianities within Chinese contexts, which are obviously multiple, can help inform world Christianity about what Christianity actually is and the forms that it takes. And again, I think there's much space for dialogue, recognizing that these are two fields rather than two disciplines.
Thank you very much. I think the question is of course, as Dr. McLeister says, there's a lot of different ways to look at this question. And I remember one time speaking to Andrew Walls, who's of course has an important legacy here in the Center for Study of World Christianity in Edinburgh. But I remember speaking to him once, and he was saying how in his early studies, he wanted to actually be a missionary in China. But then the Cultural Revolution happened, and that was not possible anymore. So he went to Africa instead. And it's kind of an interesting anecdote, because it kind of raises the question for me: how would world Christianity be different if Andrew Walls went to China? Of course, we can't unwind history there, and we can't unwind the Cultural Revolution or any of this. But whatever academic job, or it goes back to the question that or the point that I made earlier, that so many of the scholars who study Chinese Christianity don't have it on their title, right? When I applied for my job here, one of the questions on my interview was, define world Christianity. And I went blank. So please be prepared. If you apply for a job that says world Christianity, think about that question. But that was a question that I didn't really think about. But actually, oftentimes, world Christianity is partly what is it? The whole is made up of its parts, right? But vice versa, that there's something that can be learned in two different directions.
I don't understand myself that transnational Christianity or Christianity outside of China is world Christianity, or China's interaction with the world. I don't think of that as world Christianity. It seems to me, I think as Mark was maybe pointing out, that there's a separate thing of a field, which is an academic field called world Christianity with its own methodologies. It's not about Christianity in the world. It's about something, esoteric that we don't quite understand unless we do it. I'd like somebody to, kill that one for me, but part of the reason why those of us who do China is that China always somehow doesn't quite fit the categories of the rest of the world. It rebuffs them, whether we're talking about the colonial era and a post-colonial, or whether we're talking about the non-asymmetric time with the missionaries in the Ming and Qing. China, stands aside from, and therefore doesn't stand in the train of, the intellectual discourses and questions that are going on in most of the rest of world Christianity at any given time. And I think that's still true in the present to a certain degree. But I'd be very glad if somebody could at some point explain exactly how the field of world Christianity stands and interacts with Chinese Christianities as we understand them.
Thank you very much. So the question that Dr. Wildwood has asked for Professor Starr is off a comment that Professor Starr made about good and bad Chinese Christian literature. And the question is, how do you evaluate that? Particularly in terms of fiction.
I suppose, we're all subjective as literary critics is the bottom line. But I'm thinking of the really didactic literature that's written for the purpose of engaging audiences with Christianity or trying to convert people through the written word, as opposed to literature or fiction that's written for the sheer verve of being alive and wanting to explore a literary theme, as an author. I could point to some very specific names, but I don't particularly want to, because I think it's unfair to impose my subjective view of literature on others. But I think that distinction is not even between high literature or popular literature. There's some great, scientific sci-fi literature out in China at the moment, and some of that, with Christian themes and leanings. It's not a genre I particularly enjoy, but I wouldn't say that's bad literature. But I think there is very, stilted or literature written out of some kind of evangelical didactic bent that doesn't actually seek to be literature. That for me is a distinction.
Dr. Wildwood has asked for a good example. One that you like.
So Beitun, a contemporary Christian writer, I talk about his book, The Baptizing River, or River Baptism, in an article. He began as an author. He began as a writer. He was well known as a writer before he converted and became a Christian, and has then written quite a lot of works on anger and various things from a Christian perspective. Now, his turning work was also quite heavy-handed in biblical quotation and things, and not very assured. But as he's developed as a Christian writer, his writing is really excellent and a great contemporary writer to read.
Okay, Professor Kwok-Luan would like to ask a question.
I would like to ask if one of you can comment on the status of research on women in Chinese Christianity.
So I've just been translating 汉语神学读本, an anthology of Chinese Christianity, into English. And I am actually having to go out and find more pieces by women because they weren't included in that 2008-2009 volume at all. They exist. So there is as you know, there's a great cohort of young Chinese academics now, well, young meaning in their 30s and 40s, who are producing great work, thinking about, questions like the Syro-Phoenician woman and what that means, or people like Tian Haihua in Sichuan, or Liang Hui in Zhejiang, who are working on biblical studies, especially from a feminist perspective and thinking about that, or some Chinese feminist theologian work going on. It's hard work, I think. I think the hierarchies with some level of embedded sexism in the Chinese mainland academia is a problem for colleagues. And the retirement age of women being earlier and that kind of thing is also a problem. And for Christians, if you identify as a Christian, getting promoted to full professor or being a departmental chair or anything like that are, again, serious problems. So I think things are looking up and looking optimistic, but still structural imbalances.
I think if I recall correctly, a few years ago, Shanghai University sponsored a conference on women in Chinese Christianity. And recently, the Xiao and his center regularly periodically sent out those catalog. I saw this collection of conference paper. It's all about women in Chinese Christianity. It's very, very impressive, very, very, very substantial. That's all I can say. Of course, everybody still benefit from work of Professor Chloë, and many years back.
Yes, I think for myself, I still refer students and myself to the works of Professor Chloë, not only your PhD that you published, but your more recent edited volumes as well. Thank you very much. We have a question from Jane Meng on the chat. I'd like to hear more interaction with Professor Starr's comments on the definition of world Christianity and its relationship with Chinese Christianity, particularly what was meant by the esotericism of the field in Professor Starr's view. Professor Starr?
I'll let others answer, as she was asking for interaction with the...
Well, perhaps you could speak to the esoteric point.
I can't remember what I referred to at this point. I'll have to rewind the tape. You might skip to Joshua Dawei Sim's question because it's very similar and I think it can be answered together. It says, moving beyond world Christianity, there seems to be little interaction between Chinese Christianity and the field of world history. I wonder if the panel has any comments on the potential of world history in enhancing research in the field. So we could answer this one and then go back to Jacob Shushong's question in a moment.
No. Perhaps Dr. Yao could take that.
Well, just a little bit. And of course, I have not think this whole thing through, but by teaching world Christianity, we are all very familiar with work like Dr. Scott Sundquist and other historian of global Christianity, world Christianity. I think it's them who take initiative to try to include the Chinese Christian story into their grand narrative of global Christianity. Whether it's successful or not, this is really my first time to hear a colleague in the study of Chinese Christianity, Dr. Starr, to respond to approach to Chinese Christianity from the perspective of global Christianity. And so this is a very, very meaningful response. So I need to think about it. I don't say, I'm not ready to say I'm 100% great, but I need to think about it. Yeah. But I think we all need to think about it because, I'm not aware of any scholar in the study of Chinese Christianity take initiative significantly to argue, okay, the Chinese Christian story is a part of global Christian stories. It's more like an initiative from a scholar like Dr. Scott Sundquist and others.
Oftentimes, it's scholars who are interested in world Christianity or global Christianity, however you want to term it, who go into looking at select case studies or whatnot from China and from Africa and so forth, as opposed to the other way around. I think if I could speak as a scholar in Chinese Christianity who came here to the center. I was very much thrown into world Christianity when I came here, not only at my interview, But as I started teaching classes, and the classes I had to teach, had to encompass much more than just what I knew best, which was Chinese Christianity. And in many ways, I think for myself, that has really challenged the ways that I have looked at Chinese Christianity. But also, there have been certain methods and certain ways of looking at, for instance, Ghanaian theology, which for myself have been quite influential in how I view Chinese theology in recent days. And so I think the cross-pollination of the different regions in one sense has benefits, but also I think what Joshua raises in terms of world history, but transnationalism. This is something that Justin Tay, who's a scholar, his main focus is perhaps in North American Chinese Christianity, in Canada and the U.S., but he's talked a lot about the transnational component of Chinese Christianity and how it can learn from that as well. Daniel's asked, what would be the current research issues or topics in the history of Chinese Bible translation? Okay. Perhaps Professor Starr can start with that.
I'm just looking at a whole variety of questions in the chat at the moment, and had been assuming we'd go to the one for Dr. McLeister next about church-state opposition. I think there's some interesting work being done on Bible translation. I always get PhD applicants wanting to work on that, and I say I'm not a translation studies person. Please go into a translation studies field. There's a lot of work being done about the new volume. There's a lot of obviously opposition and worry about the Chinese government enforcing applying its own ideas and standards to Chinese Christianity in demanding certain things of new Bible translations at the moment. And so that is a church-state question as well. Other than that, I throw it to other colleagues.
Thank you. Perhaps we'll take that church-state question as a last one with Dr. McLeister, which is, as the model of opposition in church and state relationship becomes outdated, in your opinion, which model has the most interpretive potential in the future?
I'm not sure it's clear what other models there are. I mean, I think as someone who works with, as a single sort of church or series of church or a group of church communities in China in a very specific place, my research is embedded very much in one locale. And I think, certainly I think the idea that church and state are in opposition to each other is outdated. And I think over the last decade, a lot of studies in lots of different fields within, or lots of different disciplines and areas within Chinese Christianities have begun to sort of dissect that and realize that, that the Chinese state itself is plural and porous, but also that the churches in different contexts and coming from different theological stances approach the state in lots of different ways. And I think a lot of that has been sort of muddied. The waters of that discussion have been muddied. And I think that the main approach moving forward is to see more specific case studies and to look at these interactions over time in order to get a feel of, well, if it's not opposition or resistance, then what is it? Certainly something that I've tried to draw out in my work is the idea of negotiation. And I think it's negotiation on both sides. I don't think it's a one-sided church community trying to negotiate with, a monolithic state. I think it's very much the state also trying to negotiate with various processes and expressions of power from Chinese Christian communities. So I think that looking at case studies and looking at specific examples on the ground will reveal a lot more about the complex processes that are taking place and are playing out. as time goes on.
Thank you very much for that. I think that that's what Dr. McLeister says is in some ways some of the conversation is sort of guided by, I would say is guided by an American view of what church-state relations should be, and that is a bias that some people would be coming at the subject. Obviously, there are some real conflicts that exist within China, but it is not limited to that. And as you say, this negotiation and the relationship is more perhaps more porous than as it often is projected as. Well, I think we're over our time, and looking at the chat feed, I can see that there's more questions we could entertain. But at this point, I think we'll have to draw our formal time to close. But please join me in thanking our panelists.